Everyone can hear me too, yes? Beautiful. All right, perfect. Thank you, Molly, and thank you to the museum as a whole for having me tonight. I'm very excited to share a little bit about my work and my background. It's going to be a mix of my background, my practice, and then some insight into some of my processes in the studio as well. So you're going to get a little bit of everything tonight, okay? So like Molly said, my name is Mya Cluff. I am from Belgrade and grew up in Dallas, Oregon, which is a little bit south of Portland, Oregon. My husband and family and I have been in Montana since 2017 and have made Montana our home, and we love it here. So with no further ado, we'll get into it. So my practice as a whole is all under the very large umbrella of maternity and motherhood and the maternal experience. So as a starting point, I always have to start right here. So this is right after the birth of my first child, my daughter Isla, and I was 20 when I had her, and right smack in the middle of my bachelor's degree. So I had her on summer break, very conveniently, not planned that way, between my second and third year of my bachelor's. So right at a really pivotal time in my life as an art student, really trying to figure out who I was as a person, being a young adult, and also who I was as an artist. And so having her right in that middle section where I was also about to be coming into my pre-thesis and my thesis year really influenced where I went, because all of a sudden I had a child of my own, and I said, you know, where's motherhood and maternal issues in art history? It's definitely not coming up in my art history classes. But we'll get to that in a minute. So I went to the Oregon College of Art and Craft in Portland for my bachelor's degree. It was a really small private art school that housed about 250 students, ranging from bachelor's to MFA program. And it unfortunately has since closed after a 112-year history. It shut down in 2019. But I was able to get through unscathed, thankfully. So just a little bit of background about my training. This was, like I said, it was the Oregon College of Art and Craft, so craft emphasis was very important. I was a ceramic concentration. There were wood, printmaking, drawing and painting, fiber, and metal smithing, and I feel like one more, book arts also at this school. So we had, the constant discussion of what is fine art versus craft and how do they intermingle and mix, and the importance of the handmade, and on and on. So that is also kind of just a undercurrent of who I am as a person and my work as well. This is an example of, I think this was during my pre-thesis year, and kind of during the balance of being a mother and also a student and trying to get it all done. So this was at the ceramic studio at OCAC. And young and naive thesis student going into a year of chaos with a 1-year-old. And again, like I said, trying to finish up that bachelor's degree. A little peek into my BFA thesis studio. And then, so like I mentioned before, a big part of what I was coming up against was really trying to figure out where my interest was going to be fitting into kind of the art canon as a whole. Like I said, maternal issues, motherhood specifically, wasn't coming up in my art history courses, especially through kind of this very intense male lens, right, that art history is traditionally viewed through. And so a lot of my thesis was just trying to figure out for myself kind of the groundwork, okay, who am I looking at historically to be able to then be in conversation with moving forward. So I just want to show some of my kind of early influences. I'll just kind of pop through these slides. So a really important first one is Mary Kelly. She was an artist who created this work called the Postpartum Document. So in this slide here, you can see it was a very large installation, and then this is an example of first a mold made of the artist's son's hand, and then this is residue from his diaper. So she was analyzing an analog, or analoging all of this kind of detritus from her son and all these mundane caretaking rituals that she was going through, and really looking at this experience of her motherhood and her relationship with her son through a very analytical lens, which is, we think kind of male, right? Very scientific and serious, not at all sentimental, which is kind of the taboo word that comes up with motherhood, as far as being seen traditionally through a quote-unquote serious art world lens. Okay, so she was trying to come, and this work was made in the 1970s to put it into a historical context. So she was one of the first to really try and upend this stereotype that motherhood was purely sentimental, you know, Hallmark Mother's Day cards, mom coming home at the end of the school day with fresh baked cookies, kind of an existence, and showing it for what it was, which was a much more nuanced and rounded experience. So some more, I'll breeze through some of these influences. This is Bethany Hayes, Janine Antoni, who continues to still be a really important influence in my work. Kathy Kolowitz, Christina West, Kiki Smith, Susan Hiller, Megan Wynn, Sarah Irvin, Mary Cassatt, Renee Cox, Judy Chicago, Alice Neal, Eleanor Carucci, Sally Mann, Christina Cordova. So this is, again, a very, this represents a lot of really intense. It seems like I just throw these up on the slides now, and I think about how much time and energy I put into just tracking all these women down or all these artists down to figure out what this was. And now it's so easy to breeze through and say, oh, yeah, these are the people that, but it was really hard to figure out where they were, because it was hard to find concise places where they were all kind of in the same conversation. So another really important influence that started when I was going through this thesis setting was looking at literary investigations of maternal theory and feminist theory. And so one of the first texts that I really grappled onto was Of Woman Born by Adrienne Rich. And it just really, again, represents the influence and the importance that I take from looking into the theoretical realm of maternity and feminism. So a really important text, or a really important quote from this text, is this here that I still think about today, is nothing could have prepared me for the realization that I was a mother, one of those givens, when I knew I was still in a state of uncreation myself. That calm, unambivalent woman who moved through the pages of the manuals I read seemed as unlike me as an astronaut. Nothing, to be sure, had prepared me for the intensity of relationship already existing between me and a creature I had carried in my body and now held in my arms and fed from my breasts. Throughout pregnancy and nursing, women are urged to relax, to mime the serenity of Madonnas. No one mentions the psychic crisis of bearing a first child. So as a young woman who was just, again, coming into this role of motherhood, this really spoke to me. And this, what I learned later in my career is coined as, I always say it wrong because I always read it, adolescence matrescence, which is similar to adolescence, right? It's this intense hormonal shift, this intense societal shift that women go through when they go through this phase of becoming a mother. And so I was really kind of grappling with these feelings of trying to keep my own identity, but also learning this new identity of mother and figuring out where this all kind of landed in my lap. And so what that culminated in was my thesis work for my BFA. So these pieces, left to right, are titled Descend, Unconditional, and Transcend. So you can really see in the two figures especially this kind of duality that was going on of really intense loving and nurturing, and then on the other hand this ambivalence of like, but I still want to be myself, I still want to not be completely saturated in motherhood, and where does this land between? The piece in the middle, Unconditional, was, you can see better in this picture, the size of a queen size quilt, and all of the tiles, you can kind of see in this picture, there's Isla, a little bit older when I was graduating. All the tiles were clay tile clay squares that I had crocheted. Me and my mother actually had crocheted all these granny squares. I dipped them in a clay slip and fired them, so it just left this copy of the original fabric. So all of the tiles are ceramic and fragile and breakable. Like I said, this was right when I was graduating my thesis, finally being free of the academic realm, right? Isla was 2, and we were on to the next phase of our life. So after graduating, we moved to Belgrade, as I said. The draw to move to Belgrade from Portland, Oregon, where we were living, was, joke on us, thinking it was going to be a lower cost of living, first of all. Real funny. Second of all, just the really amazing and intense ceramic community that is found in the state of Montana. I had applied to, all of the residencies. There's 3 major residencies in the state, if you're not aware. 1 in Red Lodge, 1 in Helena, and 1 in Missoula. I got denied by all, but still being with the gumption that I had, I said, if I can just go to the state and meet people, I'll figure stuff out and I'll find things to do, right? Which definitely was the case. I've been really lucky to participate in a short-term residency at Red Lodge Clay, and have also worked with world-renowned artists like Beth Kavanagh, who lives in Helena. And so it's just been a really amazing place to grow roots and begin this part of my life and as an early career artist. So the first year after thesis was rough. You can see the very glamorous garage that I was working in, trying again to balance the artistry and the motherhood with Isla in tow all the way. But finally, we did buy our house in Belgrade a year later. So this is my home studio where I still work. It is not nearly this clean as it was then, but nonetheless, lots of good work is coming from it. So let's see, like I said, I was able to do a short-term residency at Red Lodge Clay in 2019, which kind of leads me to the second phase of my career as an artist and a mother when I had my second child, Landon. So I was pregnant, I was about 7 months pregnant when I did that residency at Red Lodge. And so this is this next stage of my life as a mother and an artist, now balancing 2 children with a home studio. And I always like to include this picture because I was very proud of myself. He was probably a couple weeks old at this point, and I said, I'm gonna get in the studio, I'm gonna go do something. And I took a picture to document, and not 2 minutes later, he had puked all down my shirt. And I had to go inside and start over and say, you know what? I was in the studio, at least. I stepped inside, and that's what counts, right? So anyway, so the next little bit, we'll talk about some of the work that I made after this. So this piece is called On the Cusp. And like I said, it was kind of in this next phase post Landon, my second child. Actually, in this picture, you can see I was overdue, I'm pretty sure, about 40 weeks, maybe a little bit more, pregnant with him. And on this side over here, you can see the legs sticking out, right? That's this piece here. It's up on an armature, and so I was actively working on this piece while I was pregnant with him, and then finished up after I delivered him, after I came back from maternity leave. So this piece was a really important piece for me, especially because when I got pregnant and had Isla, like I said, I was very young, I was freshly married, and I got pregnant unexpectedly, right? So I was really thrown into it. In the middle of my BFA, it was very tumultuous, all this kind of stuff. And then I had Landon, and he was, Isla was no less loved, but there was more of an intention behind it. And so it's that saying of you can always see hindsight 2020, right? That I look back on this piece and I'm like, there's a lot of empowerment that happened here, a lot of kind of intentionality where I had been through the experience of being pregnant, I had been through the experience of giving birth, and this piece really kind of sums all that up, where I was feeling more, like I said, just intentional and empowered, and you can really see it in this piece. So the other thing that was funny about this piece is that I base it off of a medical, like a children's medical, not textbook, but instructional book, kind of about pregnancy and reproduction and all kind of stuff. And there was this specific picture in there of this, like an illustration of this woman who was pregnant, and there was, I think her stomach was cut off so you could see what was going on in the uterus as the baby was growing. And she just had this completely blissed out look, like, I'm not here. It was very like, 1970s era, like we're not going to talk about kind of the pain of birth, right? But I decided to take that and kind of shift it into more of the female figure having the intentionality of empowerment rather than just that kind of, like Adrienne Rich talked about that Madonna-like tranquility kind of thrust upon her. So her eyes are closed. She's very much one with herself and one with her experience. It was the first time that I was really kind of looking at what labor and giving birth would look like in my work. And then it was really fun too. I did put some Easter eggs in here. So because I did this kind of constellation starscape situation, if you look on her belly, there is the Big Dipper, right? And then on her chest is Virgo, which is my zodiac sign. So again, kind of semi-autobiographical. And you can kind of see that theme throughout. I didn't say this before, but when I was making that thesis work, again, looking back on it now, I wasn't really brave enough to say, like, this is my experience. I'm going to be looking at it through the academic lens. But it definitely was at least semi-autobiographical, right? Even though I didn't necessarily completely understand that at the time. So this piece is getting a little bit closer to that, where it's not a full self-portrait, but it is definitely inclusive and reminiscent of the experience I was going through. This piece is called Where Do I End and You Begin? Which is another piece that was post-Landon. And it is a installation that was comprised of about 150 tiles. Each tile was what's the word that I'm thinking for? A cropped image of either myself or Landon, and they're completely intermixed. It was always really funny when I had this piece on display. I think maybe one woman asked me this, but it was almost always men that would come up to me and say, if I just rearrange this, would it make a picture? Like, is it a jigsaw puzzle situation? And I don't know what it was exactly that the really analytical side would come out of people and say, like, I just want to put it back together. Can we? But the intention behind it was that it was because it was abstracted and mixed in this way. I really wanted to talk about the intensity of the mundane cycles of caretaking, so the breastfeeding and the changing and the cleaning and the holding and the rocking and all this really physical, sensual aspect of having newborns specifically. Like, that kind of tapers off as you have older children, but that initial newborn stage into toddlerhood is just so much of them touching you, you touching them. They call it almost I've heard it called the fourth trimester, right? After you give birth, then there's so much connection that happens in those first few months of caretaking and learning who this new person is. That the title came from being Where Do I End and You Begin, is that those boundaries are still blurred, those lines are still blurred as far as where I was, again, as an individual and talking about identity, and then where this new person was coming literally from me and then still slowly detaching themselves from me through those first year, really, of life. So the next slide too is these are some of the examples of the images that I would work off of. So I would crop them ahead of time on my computer and just have them set up in the studio and look from. So you can see the hand specifically is that hand on the far left. So I would source the images just from snapshots that I had on my phone, and then again, crop them and have them right to size on my computer, so I had that direct reference right in front of me as I worked. All right. This piece is The Myth of Complete Balance. So this is the one that's featured here in the upstairs gallery, like Molly talked about. This piece, I really love this piece. I'm really glad to see it here at the museum too. I think it looks really lovely. So this piece is a little bit more abstract. We were talking about how the autobiographical nature could come through my work. This one's a little bit more abstract, kind of talking generally about the societal force of, and the lens of, again, viewing motherhood as kind of this sentimental role and the elusive nature of, quote unquote, having it all, right? So I really wanted to kind of tackle this idea of balance and how this idea of balance gets thrown around a lot, but I kind of have an aversion to, because when I think of balance, I think of having to have it all together all the time, right? And you know, think of like a teeter-totter or scales or something like that, where you have all of these things piled on top and trying to figure it out all together, when I really tend to look at it and liken it more to picking up and putting down, right? Where there are, especially now that my oldest daughter is going to be turning 10 this summer, I'm almost a full decade into motherhood, I'm able to see now that so much of these seasons that I've gone through are, have been having to kind of choose to some extent, like when do I need to kind of put something away so I can focus on something else. There is definitely those moments where I'm able to do multiple things at once, but usually that means that everything is lacking, where when I'm able to kind of focus, whether that be a day of focus or a week of focus or months of focusing on one thing and put one other thing to the side, then those things all grow. But it really is kind of figuring out how, not to separate, but how to prioritize your mental health, if nothing else, over this myth or really intense societal pressure to be able to do everything all the time and be there for everyone all the time. So, like I said, the title is The Myth of Complete Balance. So I chose to have this baby as kind of this idolized golden color. And you can see that the woman is obviously holding this in not a way that you would actually be able to hold this in the real world, because she's definitely not of mortal beings, right? She's this kind of celestial body, this mythical being that has this superhuman power to just do it, right? To just have it and hold it and be able to encompass this idealized version of motherhood and almost womanhood as a whole, right? Whether this is talking about literally motherhood or it just becomes a symbolism of what is expected of womanhood, whether that means that the intense pressure of becoming a mother, because many people do not or cannot. I think all of that is kind of wrapped up in this here. So some more views of her. I always, the image that comes to mind here, or to me personally too, is, you know, when you think of like a circus seal, just like balancing the ball on its head. Very much, that's what always kind of brings up to my mind as well. So this very performative aspect, this very, this very performative aspect that is serving for a public rather than serving for self. Okay, so we can jump into kind of some process pictures. So there's kind of two general ways that I like to work in the studio. I either coil build my pieces, and a coil meaning a round circular piece of clay you think about when you are taking elementary ceramics classes and you're making snakes, right? That's what coil building is. You just make lots of those snakes and layer them one upon the other to build a form. So this piece is fun because I had that aspect of building in it for the blue woman herself. And then the other way that I build, which I learned from Beth Kavanagh, like I said, who I've worked with, and Helena, as well as another amazing artist named Tip Toland. I took a workshop from both of them, a 2-week workshop at the Bray in Helena, probably 2018. But from them, I learned this process of building solid, where you sculpt the piece completely solid, usually on an armature, and then once it's almost completely done, you cut it apart, hollow it out, and reassemble it. So we'll get to that part in a minute, but it's nice that this piece kind of has both of those aspects in it, so we'll cover both. So coil building is how I was able to build the blue woman. So you can see in the background on the wall, I've got a sketch that I did from a model of what I wanted the pose to be. So I've always got that to look on, and then what you can't see on the computer black screen is that I also have multiple pictures of different angles of a model, so I can always be kind of thinking in the round. I really like to talk and think about I think this harkens back to my craft school experience, right? Is that in my practice, I really like looking at my ideas through what I like to say are different lenses, right? So I can do a lot of problem solving pre-starting a work in sculpture if I look at it through photos or through sketches or through collages, and kind of figure out some big, maybe stumbling blocks that I might encounter before I dive into committing to a full ceramic sculpture, right? So you can see I've got all of that stuff all around. And then, this piece is not the same piece, but I wanted to show this one because it really shows those coils that I was talking about. So this whole piece was coil built, and I work in sections, let that part stiffen up a little bit, and then work higher and higher as I go. And you can see those coils at the top that are not refined at all. I just have big, thick coils to be able to get height. I scratch those surfaces up and blend them together, and then hide any kind of seams and make it into this organic shape that is the human form. Okay, so this piece as it's growing up. So now you can see on the computer screen, I've got all of those different images. So I'm really kind of focusing in on one section of the body at a time, looking at it from different angles. And so this really shows too where the legs are basically done, the legs and feet, because those were first, obviously, as I'm going up. And then how it's all roughed and jagged still and not detailed or honed in toward this top is because that part of the sculpture is still relatively wet as I'm going through and making it. But the bottom part has to be basically done before you go up, so again, it can support the weight of the clay that's being added on later. This is me working on it. I had to climb all the way up onto the table because she was so big to be able to do all kind of these finishing touches. And then just a fun behind the scenes here too is that I deconstructed my kiln so there's multiple rings that are on the kiln. I took off the first ring of the kiln to be able to put her in, right, with the help of my husband. And then I put the second ring on, ta-da, but wait, when you look at it from the other angle, she was too big for my kiln. So I had to do some last minute pivoting, and with the help of my husband, Dallas, who's a beautiful woodworker in his own right. I steal his tools all the time. He cut down soft bricks for me, and then we had to build an extension onto my kiln to put the lid on and then fire it. So for those of you in the ceramics world, just a reminder to always check the interior height of your kiln before you commit to how tall a piece is going to be, because it's no fun when you hit that point. So then the second part of the sculpture, which is the baby, I built solid. So kind of a glimpse into why I would choose one or the other. When we're looking at, sorry, go way back here. When we're looking at the blue woman, there were two things that I was thinking about. Number one, I was preparing for a solo show in Bozeman at the time when I was making this one. So the coil building construction is a lot quicker. So I was under a little bit of a time crunch, so I wanted to do something quick. But then also the pose of this woman aided my ability to work with coils because it's basically vertical, right? When you think back to the piece of the woman who was birthing and she was hanging on the wall with all these arms and legs going out all over the place, that kind of a pose is not as conducive to coil building because there's no flat bottom anywhere, and you have all of these pieces that need supports because they're hanging horizontally in space, right? So those are the two kind of things that I'm thinking about when I'm making a piece. I have to take those into consideration. So then when we look at the baby, right, because I wanted her to just balance ever so slightly on the top of this woman's forehead and really have that connection point be as minimal as possible, I didn't want, again, to have any kind of a flat bottom, so coil building was going to be a lot trickier if I did that. And then I also had all of the complexity of the arms and legs kind of interlocking over each other. So building solid made sense in this case, so that I could be more gestural, because that's the other thing, is that if you have a piece that needs to have a little bit more gesture and fluidity to it, that's also easier to accomplish when solid building, because all of the clay can generally be the same level of wetness or workability. Whereas I mentioned with the coil building, the bottom section has to stiffen up before you can move on to the next section, so that it can carry that weight. Now that being said, when you're coil building, you can definitely go back and edit, but it is a lot easier when everything's at the same wetness, right? So this piece I built solid, and then this is part of what it looks like when I cut it apart. I get the piece almost all the way sculpted. In this case though, probably with other pieces would sculpt like the eyes and the face to a little bit more completion, but because I had all of these places with these undercuts where I couldn't get to the foot or the underside of an arm, I did leave it a little bit rougher so that when I cut it, I could get to those sections easier without having to worry about the integrity of the rest of the piece, be able to finish that off. So this is another section. You can just kind of barely see the inside where I've started to hollow it out, so I included another piece. This is a piece that I built on an armature, and I'm showing this one because I have a really clear picture of what it looks like when I've cut it apart and disassembled it. So you can see this was all solid, and this one specifically was on a pipe armature, so I'd have to cut it off of the pipe, pull it off in sections, hollow it all out to about 1/4 inch to a 1/2 inch thickness of wall thickness all the way around to make sure that it's not super heavy, first of all, and also will dry evenly and be more efficient to finish off in the kiln. So that shows you, again, kind of the background that I don't have images of the baby. But when she was all done, there she is. Just like my human babies, my artwork is my baby as well. All right, and then, how are we doing on time? We'll kind of skip through these two. These are just another couple little pieces, or not little, but a couple pieces of mine that I like to talk about because they continue to be touchstones. They were made a few years ago, but this one specifically is called Crown. And the symbol and the imagery of the pelvis is something that continues to come up in my work a lot. This was the first time that I really utilize the symbol of the pelvis. And in this piece, I was thinking about it literally through the idea of the pelvis is the transition point when you're giving birth, right? The baby is going through. And then, so putting it onto the human or the adult figure, kind of not reclaiming, but taking from that tradition of traditional imagery of birth and putting it onto the woman, saying like, you went through a really intense transitionatory process as well. But I really like kind of the bare bones, what coming to mind, the bare bones nature of kind of the raw aspect of the skeletal structure and putting that in again to kind of subvert the sentimentality that comes through motherhood. So it's kind of a Reader's Digest version on this piece, but there's a close-up of the pelvis itself. And then this is a portrait of my daughter when she was about 4 or 5, I think. This piece is called Heirloom, or What is Passed Down. And this piece I was thinking a lot about more of the psychological aspect of motherhood and this idea of what children and offspring are inheriting. In this case, kind of this idea of maternal rage, or taking the idea of mother bear as protector, but also maybe taking that idea of mother bear as aggressor, or maybe abuser is too strong of a word, but the idea of kind of having to hone your intentionality as motherhood, making sure that you are not passing on harm through just the own struggles that you're going through this process. So she's holding on to this, what is in a stuffed bear sized object, but is more not hyper realistic, but more along those realms of realism, as if it is a real bear that has been gilded, to talk again about this duality of protection and aggression. So then I just wanted to touch on this kind of next phase of my work, and it was really funny putting these slides together. Was the first time that I really kind of looked at my career as an artist through these kind of epochs of each child, right? So this is a picture of me pregnant with my 3rd and final child, who is now 1.5 years old. And so this is, again, kind of thinking about this third phase of my parenthood and of my artistry, right? So with this pregnancy with Sawyer, my husband and I decided that 3 was going to be it. So I was really fortunate to know that ahead of time and be able to go into the pregnancy knowing that it was going to be my last. And so I really intentionally took some time back. I took some time off. I didn't make as much work. Being pregnant as a 30-year-old versus being pregnant as a 20-year-old was a very physically different experience. And so it was just also a lot harder to get into the studio and be making that physical work. And so I chose to take a step back and not be in production as much as I had in the other pregnancies, especially my first, like I said, when I was a student and I was taking 18 credits a semester and just trying to get that bachelor's done. It was nice to have that duality of being able to say, like, I'm just gonna chill for a second. And so I decided to take a lot of that time and delve into more of the research again, because I had made all this work that I showed you, plus more in, like I said, this kind of second phase of post-Landon. And I felt like I was definitely in like I said earlier, that umbrella of maternity and motherhood, but I also kind of had this aching feeling that I was being pulled in kind of these microcosms. Like we had, like I said, the psychological aspect of the heirloom piece, and we had the physical aspect of the where do I end and you begin, and there was another piece that I didn't show that talked about maternal lineage and all these kind of subcategories that were really interesting, but I felt like I was jumping around too much and not giving enough of my time and attention and energy to any of them to really serve them to what I felt like they could fully be. So I wanted to kind of back up, talk about look at the research more, and where that's kind of led me into this new phase of working, which is thinking about this series of work based on this article by Claudia Day called Mothers as Makers of Death. And this article was, again, another one of those anchor points for me where I read it and I reread it and I reread it, and I thought about the title so much and thinking, looking back on my work, this is kind of a tie to a lot of the different stuff where I'm thinking about mortality. I'm trying to find these ways to make work that makes motherhood look like the really intense psychological feat that it is, and try to give that to the audience in a way that isn't trite or just comes off in a way that is understandable, because it's really easy also when I'm making to feel like, oh, but my kids are cute, right? Oh, but like all these positive things in motherhood. And that is part of it, but I wanted to make sure that I continue to keep to that truth of looking at the aspects of, postpartum depression, maternal anxiety. And again, this really kind of wrapped it up where I'm like, oh, all of these things, all these people that I created, they're going to die. I'm going to die. Like, how is that going to affect them? How will that affect me? When will that happen? It's just kind of this, again, undercurrent of what my relationship is with them, what my relationship is with myself, and then again, what I'm thinking about, because my work is artistic practice, what's going to be going into this work. So that's kind of what, this is all very fresh. The next couple things I'm going to show you are works that are all in progress, but things that are kind of on my mind right in the here and now, trying to figure out where this new kind of, hopefully a little bit more succinct body of work is going to go into. So last summer? Last summer, I was able to do a month-long residency in Oregon at the Chehalem Cultural Center in their ceramic studio. And so this piece is one that I made there. So this is a sketch, like I said, looking through my work at lots of different lenses. I like to sketch. So this is kind of the sketch of this initial idea of this piece that is titled Remembering. So it's this hand, I'll show it in a couple minutes. But I wanted to think about this idea of, with the idea of death and mortality, I'm looking into memento mori a lot, or this idea of remembering death to live a better life, right? And so that made me think of the old idea of tying a string on your finger to remind yourself of something, to keep something in your brain. So I wanted to put this pelvis, or this symbol of kind of death and creation, on the finger as either that string, or people also view it as like a ring, but it still works in that idea that it is a memento, it is a small token to carry with you to remember kind of this undercurrent. So just kind of, again, showing background of, I start with a sketch, and then this is a very rough maquette, so we're just a small sculpture, a small 3D sketch. And then this was the final piece that I created while I was in residency. So the scale on this is, I think it's about 20 inches high or so. So it's a very oversized hand, kind of thinking as the hand as a monument, and then this pelvis as an undersized memento, or kind of this thing to keep remembrance. So there's that piece. Again, that kind of harkens back also to the piece Crown, where that pelvis imagery keeps coming into play. There's another, I didn't include it in this slideshow, but there's another piece that I have that is called My Mother Before Me. That is a series of 7 pelvises that hang in a vertical line. That was inspired by a text by an author named Molly Caro May, and I think it goes something along the lines of, what if we think of, or she alludes to the idea of thinking about all these pelvises stacked on top of each other, of my mother and her mother before me and her mother before me, and this line of maternal lineage that becomes a strong spine, right? And so I took that inspiration from that text and then built a a piece off of that. But so again, to show that the pelvis keeps coming back up, and this is the latest iteration of that. And then finally, and most recently, I've got this piece. Like you said, you can see this is on the top of the lid of my kiln. This piece is currently in my kiln drying. I'm going to be firing it and finishing up the next couple weeks. But the work, or the working title of this piece is To Protect the Unprotectable. And again, I got inspiration reading Blue Nights by Joan Didion, where she was talking about the mortality of her daughter, and kind of grappling with this idea that of the mortality of your children, and that we, as parents, we pledge to protect these people, knowing that at the end of the day, it will be not all for naught, but that they will die eventually, they will eventually pass. And so this really intense, again, relationship of trying to acknowledge their mortality while also being completely committed to maintaining their safety and their well-being and all of this kind of stuff. And so this piece is a portrait of my youngest, Sawyer, who, like I said, is a year and a half now. Using this portrait of him balancing precariously on this hand with this kind of cloud or smoke being this, again, kind of inevitable plume that is around that is just part of our lives, and we can, brush it away and burst through it, but eventually there will be an end, and just kind of grappling with that idea that mortality will be there for us all. So, and then I just have this last image of, again, thinking through different lenses. This was a collage that I made, just trying to kind of ideate before my residency. And so then I grappled onto this image and then created this piece here. So I'm very excited to show you all tonight. This is the first, you guys get the preview. This is the first time I've talked publicly about this kind of new line of work. So that's very exciting. And then I also got word just a couple weeks ago that I was accepted to the graduate program at MSU. So I'm hoping to take all of this new line of research and apply it to my MFA in the next couple of years. So anyway, thank you all for coming tonight, and we'll open up for some Q&A. Yes? Beautiful. Thank you. Yes, ma'am.
Well, I have a couple questions.
Okay.
I'm going to start with these last questions.
Okay.
So your children are all different ages.
Yes.
And when they're young, they're all willing to have their picture taken
Yeah.
and pose.
Yeah.
Now you say your oldest is 10.
Yes.
So I'm sure that they know these are, patterned after them, or
Right.
they are the models.
Right.
How do they feel about that?
That is a great question, and something that from the very beginning, when I was in that undergraduate program, I remember sitting down with my advisor who was married but did not have children at the time, and being like, what do I want to make this work, but I want to be personal, but also I have to respect these boundaries, and what are my kids going to think if I'm putting them in the work? And he didn't have kids, so who knows how true this was, but I remember him looking at me and being like, when your daughter's 15, she's not going to care what you're doing. She's going to have her own stuff and not be worried about it. I'm like, okay, that kind of gives me a little bit of relief. So far, in the here and now, if anything, she definitely is not adverse to it. Like I said, my daughter is my oldest, she's almost 10. But I do think kind of constantly about making sure that I'm respecting her boundaries as a person, and making sure that I'm not using her as almost like a pawn in my work or just an abstract concept. And yeah, trying to respect her personhood through that. So far, like I said, my daughter, who has the most kind of awareness because she's older, she really enjoys my work. She really enjoys that she has that portrait of her from that older standing piece. And then there's been a couple pieces too that I've been able to include her directly, collaboratively. Again, it's not a piece that I had in the slideshow, but there's a piece that I used drawings that she did and made ceramic transfers and then put those onto a figure. And so that part she really enjoyed being able to say, yeah, that I made part of it.
Now my second question, is off of that. So in all of this, there's a nurturing that comes across.
Yeah.
And your blissful lady crowning in blue, she looks like she's at the spa. Just
yeah, exactly.
happily enjoying the moment.
Yeah.
Okay, so all these have a joy to them.
Uh-huh.
Have you ever thought of the failure to thrive, the children that are not touched?
Yeah, not specifically, and that kind of ties into this idea where I think a lot about there's different things in my work where I think, how can I talk about subjects that I have not lived through, right? Like, specifically, a good example is like miscarriage. I think about miscarriage and child loss a lot. I have not personally gone through miscarriage. I have not personally gone through child loss. They are topics that I think are very important to be raised to a level of public awareness, but I haven't actively made a lot of work about those, or like you're giving the example of children who maybe are neglected, right? Because I would never want to jump into one of those topics unthoughtfully, right? Because I would not, again, talking about how I don't want to use my children as pawns, I wouldn't want to use those topics as pawns and say, I don't have personal experience with this, but I want to include it in my work. It's kind of that line again, thinking of where the respect is and making sure that I'm really thoughtful if I'm going to approach that kind of a topic, making sure that I'm really thoughtful about how I go about it, whether that would be an intense line of research or some kind of collaborative effort with maybe someone who has been through that to be able to use their experience with permission. I'm not sure, but yeah, it's definitely something that I think about a lot.
This is beautiful.
Thank you. Thank you. I appreciate it so much. Back here.
I'm curious if you can talk about the use of the blue that you
Yeah.
use in this piece.
Yeah, so let's go back. Oh my gosh, it's way back here. Okay, here she is. So the blue, it's funny. There was a series of these works where I really leaned into this really rich blue kind of starscape a couple times. So there was this piece, and then On the Cusp, and then another piece I didn't include called To Touch and Be Touched, where it was this kind of wreath of hands that were overlapping. It was like a mid-pandemic, post-pandemic piece of like, I just want everyone to touch me, but also the intensity of my children touching me all the time because I'm, in the domestic space. Anyway, but I think the blue specifically is just, I think maybe it comes into partially, I feel like there's a couple different parts. So number one, like I said, I wanted it to be this kind of like abyss or starscape, right? The celestial part of it. So the blue naturally leaned into that. I think also subconsciously, maybe with my deep background in ceramics, something I didn't mention also is that my parents are both ceramicists as well. So I grew up in ceramics and then went to college to be a ceramicist as well. Is that there's this old adage that when you put blue on a pot, it'll sell, right? Because everyone loves blue. So there's also this kind of very natural inclination I have toward the color blue as a very inviting color that is able to engage an audience. I know it'll engage an audience very easily. And so kind of a tool to draw people in to be able to talk about these topics. Yeah, thank you. Any other questions? Yes.
I don't want to take up too much time.
No, please.
More on the technique.
Yeah.
Start with that one right there. Do you have a steel bar going up through there? How does it look out?
Oh yeah, great question. I don't have a picture of it, but I utilized my husband, who's a woodworker, and he lathed me a wooden dowel that sits between those two. Yep, because I tried my hardest to get the two holes. I have a hole in her head and then a hole in the back of the baby, and I tried my hardest to get them to be the same size, but they weren't quite the same size. So my husband came to the rescue and made me a specific dowel where one end is slightly thinner and then the other is slightly thicker, so that they sit nice and snug in both parts of the sculpture. Yeah.
When you're getting to the phase where you're trying to turn your greenware into bisque.
Yeah.
And how thick? You answered some of the questions in the slides where you
Yeah.
hollow out.
Right.
It looks like you'll work with the clay solid.
Right.
And then you'll cut it.
Right.
And hollow it out. Well, how much thickness would you have? And then you have that last one with the hand. Now that's called.
So that one. So
That
yeah.
one right there answers quite a few questions.
Yeah.
And how dry does the clay have to be so you don't mess it all up while you're hollowing it out?
Yeah.
And it was an inch, 2 inches, and then how many hours does it have to dry?
Yeah, great question. So the hardness level first. So when I'm building solid, I have to, like I briefly mentioned, I sculpt almost to final detail. I like to say probably 90 to 95% done. And then I let it stiffen to not quite leather hard, but a soft leather hard, just so it's enough that it'll continue to dry out as I'm hollowing it, but as I cut it especially, it's not gonna warp a lot as I'm trying to manhandle, especially when it's on an armature or it's a larger piece and I'm really having to like pull parts off of this armature. I wanna make sure that that outer layer of the clay is gonna be stiff enough. You know, people like to say like a cheddar cheese hard, right? You can kind of indent it a little bit, stick your nail into it a little bit. It's not super hard where I can't continue to detail it later, but it's stiff enough that it's gonna maintain its shape at least, you know, vaguely, right?
Back together,
yeah.
Use some kind of slip.
Yeah, so I score the edges really well. I put slip on, and then I take a really small coil and put that around the ring, score that again, squish it together. And then this is the technique that I learned from Beth Kavanagh, where after that, then you score the seam, and then compress the seam, score it again, put another coil. So this is after the two pieces are together. You put another coil around that seam there, that connective area, and then score over that, and then smooth it out. So you have that extra connecting coil between the pieces and then around the seam as well. And I'm just really, I always like to say it's gotta look way worse before it looks better, right? So I'm really tearing up that seam to make sure that that clay is really blended together. And that really helps making sure that number one, it doesn't crack when it's drying or when it's fired. But then also I'm able to blend those connections to make sure that there isn't an obvious visual join. Definitely in some of my earlier works, I look back on it and I'm like, oh, I can it's barely there, but I can see where those pieces came together, right? And it drives me crazy. But I've gotten a lot better now where I can do it without you being able to tell where it is, yeah.
How do you deal with all the shrinkage that you're going to get before you do the actual firing?
If it's a piece that's larger, I will put it on a shrink slab, so a piece of clay with lots of holes in it that will shrink with the piece, so there's no. So it's not connected to the piece at all, but it sits on the table, and then as it dries, it will move with the larger piece as well. And again, kind of depending, something like this piece was very small. She was only about this big, so I didn't worry about that. She just shrank and it was fine. She just did it on her own. But bigger pieces, I can create those shrink slabs, let it dry, and then also fire it on that shrink say that 5 times fast, shrink slab as well, so that as it continues to shrink in the kiln also, it will all just shrink together and not pull on the kiln shelves. Yeah. So
when I can picture this one that you have up there now, the hands are not hollowed out.
No, the hands are not, not too much. I could go into the hands a little bit from the inside of the leg, right? So you can see that, well, I can see because that slide. So you can see that the holes here, right? I came in, what you can't see is that on the other side, I came in through the rump area where there was a bigger hole, and then could come into that shin and kind of come into that. But my walls generally, I like to aim for a 1/4 inch to a 1/2 inch thickness generally, but I'm comfortable if some sections get up to 1 inch. Especially if I have time to be able to let it dry out really quick. Really slowly. I always really like to talk about, there's an artist named Michelle Greger who's based in California, and she does these very kind of painterly sculptures, and her work is completely solid, and she fires it completely solid. It's these big sculptures, they're super heavy, but she just takes these blocks of clay and carves down kind of like you would marble or stone, and then she just has the availability to let things sit for months to dry out before she puts them in the kilns and fires them. Yeah. So it's possible. I don't like to play that game personally, but it's possible. Yeah.
Just a quick comment.
Yeah.
Thank you for letting us claim you as a Montana artist.
Oh, thank you. Oh my gosh, thank you so much. Thank you. Appreciate it.